I'm writing this story about something that happened to my mom when I was a little girl, so much so that I don't really remember it. The first time I heard this story from her, I was about 16 years old, and I didn't pay enough attention to remember the details. But this last time she told me everything, I was frozen with fear. My mom raised me by herself, as a single mother. She is the best thing the universe has given me, and I am enormously grateful for everything. I can never repay her enough. My mom told me that when she had her 15th birthday party, one of her godparents gave her a doll which he received from his grandparents. It was a doll with a solid porcelain face, very heavy and smooth, hand-painted with amazing details. Its clothes were also hand-knit, and the overall detail was incredible. It was like a real mini-girl. My mom loved this doll for how special and unique it was, and contrary to what one might think, instead of just keeping it as a symbolic memory, she played with the doll. She took delight in toys, games, and all sorts of playful activities, refusing to let go of her youthful wonder and curiosity. So it wasn't strange that she continued to play with dolls even when she was 15 years old. She took it everywhere. When she came back from school, she played with it, slept with it, ate with it, etc. Of course, as time went by, she grew up, became interested in other things, and other activities began to consume her time. However, that didn't stop her from dedicating at least a few minutes daily to the doll. Whether it was to comb its hair, clean its porcelain face, or wash its clothes, there was always contact with the doll. Up to that point, everything was going quite well, but the strange things began to happen when I arrived in the world. When I was born, my mom was already 24 years old. She worked at a supermarket while my grandmother took care of me. And strangely enough, my grandmother was always afraid of my mom's doll. Ever since it was given to her, my grandmother would always say, "I'm scared of your doll." One day when my mom had already left for work, my grandmother saw the doll sitting on the main living room couch, as if it was watching TV. When my mom came home, my grandmother scolded her for leaving the doll there, while knowing that my grandmother didn't like it. But my mom denied everything, telling her that she had left the doll on her bed as usual before going to work. On another one of these strange days, while my grandmother was cooking, she heard a little girl's voice coming from my mom's bedroom, where I was also asleep. But obviously, it couldn't have been me, as I was just a baby. So, when my grandmother went to see what was going on, she said that before opening the door, she heard the little girl's voice say, "Here she comes," followed by the sound of something falling. She opened the door and found my mom's doll lying on the floor next to the bed. My grandmother just kicked it under the bed because she was genuinely afraid of it and didn't even want to touch it. She returned to the kitchen to continue cooking when she heard the little voice again. She quickly ran back to the bedroom, and upon opening the door, she noticed that the doll was once again in the same place. Not only that, but she had left it under the bed, but somehow it had gotten out, or something had moved it. My grandmother told my mom about all this, but my mom couldn't believe her until one night she dreamed that the doll spoke to her saying, "Why don't you play with me anymore, Mommy? Aren't you my mommy anymore? Am I not your little girl?" She jolted awake, drenched in a cold sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. As she struggled to catch her breath, she slowly turned her head to the left, and there, sitting in the chair, was a doll with lifeless eyes staring right back at her. She realized that the doll was not where she had left it before going to bed. One day my mom was home alone. One day my grandmother took me to visit my auntie. My mom was cleaning the house, sorting out what was useful and what was not to donate or throw away. She started taking out countless clothes and piling them on a couch where the doll was sitting, such that the mountain of clothes began to bury the doll. My mom says she started to see the clothes moving, as if something from below were shifting them, and suddenly the doll rolled out, as if someone had thrown it. It emerged from the clothes and fell to the floor. The hard impact caused a crack in one of its eyes. The doll appeared peculiar, as its countenance no longer bore a typical smile. Instead, it possessed a malevolent gaze, and its lips curved upward, transforming the smile into a sinister grin. My mom was horrified. She often wondered if it was just her imagination or the result of mental exhaustion, or if it really happened. But seeing it, she says she ran out of the house. Luckily, my grandmother was already on her way back with me in her arms. She tearfully told my grandmother what had just happened. My grandmother was shocked to hear my mom's words. They immediately went back to the house to see the doll, but it was no longer lying on the floor. My mom, astonished, told her that it had fallen there, that one of its eyes had cracked, and that's where it had stayed, but it was no longer there. Silence filled the room, when suddenly it was interrupted by the sound of static on the television. The TV turned on at a very high volume, but it only transmitted and played static. They went to see what was going on, and to their surprise, there was the doll, sitting on the living room couch, just as it had once happened to my grandmother as well. My mom says that my grandmother told her she felt something evil in that doll, and that it would be better not to have it around, especially now that I was there and just a baby. My grandmother put the doll in a red shopping bag, saying that she would take it to the river at night to throw it away so that no one would see it, and the river would carry it away. According to my mom, that night I started to get sick. I had a fever, I was crying a lot, and even vomiting. My mom was worried, as was my grandmother, since nobody knew what was happening to me. My grandmother told my mom that she was going to take the doll to the river, and when she returned, she would prepare a tea for me to see if I improved. After Grandma discreetly placed the doll in my bag and departed, I immediately began to feel better. Within a mere 10 minutes, my fever had subsided. I wasn't crying anymore, and everything seemed a bit better. While my grandmother was carrying the doll in the bag at night, all alone on the way, the doll seemed to kick and flail its arms, as if it already knew what was going to happen and resisted it. It became heavier and heavier, so much so that my grandmother could barely carry it. By the time she reached the river, the doll was so heavy that she could only roll it as if it were a heavy stone. She let it fall from a small wooden bridge, but before it fell, the doll turned its head, directing its eyes towards my grandmother. It had a truly hellish gaze, with red eyes like fire, and the broken eye gave it an even more terrifying feature. My grandmother crossed herself at that moment and started to pray. She began to hear a laugh from the depths of the river. A laugh that sounded like the voice of a little girl, the same voice she had heard days before while cooking. Soon that voice turned into a cavernous, deep, monstrous voice, as my grandmother described it to my mom. When my grandmother returned home, she felt dizzy, sick, and began vomiting. She also had a fever, but gradually throughout the night, she started to feel better. I can't help but wonder if some sort of entity or spirit had taken hold of the doll and had intentions of causing harm to me. There might have been even some sort of witchcraft involved. The next morning, my mom was getting ready to go to work. When she opened the door to leave, there outside the house was the doll. It was wet and covered in mud, as if someone had pulled it out of the river and brought it there, or as if the doll itself had come out and walked there. My mom ran back in, frightened, and immediately closed the door. She woke up my grandmother and told her that the doll was there. My grandmother went out, took a rope, and tied the doll's feet and hands, and then tied it to a chair. She told my mom to go to the blacksmith and urgently request a small cage, one that would fit the doll. My mom left right away and went to the local blacksmith. She told him what my grandmother had asked for, and the blacksmith said he would have it ready by the evening because he was very busy that day. When my mom returned home, she saw my grandmother talking to the doll, and she was very surprised by this. She was even more surprised and horrified when the doll, despite having its body tied to a chair, moved as if trying to break free. My grandmother told me that it seemed to be a witch who had cast a spell to turn the doll into a puppet, intending to take the life of the baby in the house, which was me. My mom couldn't believe it. After so many beautiful moments spent with that doll, it had now become a diabolical instrument. She was in shock, lost her appetite, and was constantly thinking about how it was possible for things to have turned out this way. The day went by, and the time to pick up the small cage had come. My mom took it to the house. My grandmother blessed it and put some palm leaves left from Palm Sunday inside, along with several red ribbons, and placed the doll inside the cage. The doll writhed and kicked as if it were in pain from being trapped, and small whimpers, like those of a child, could be heard. But nothing mattered anymore. It had to be done. My grandmother went out for firewood and used it to build a bonfire in the small backyard. My mom says she arranged the pieces of wood in the shape of a cross and set them on fire. When the fire was at its peak, burning with bright flames, she placed the cage with the doll inside on top. The doll writhed even more, the whimpers grew louder, and a truly nauseating smell started to emanate, as if rotten meat or something similar was burning. As the doll burned, the terrible smell intensified, and the agonized screams eventually faded away. Once the fire had consumed the doll completely, my grandmother and mother felt that the evil presence had finally been vanquished. From that day on, we never experienced any more strange occurrences related to the doll, and finally, our family was able to live in peace.